If there's one thing I've learned living near an HOA, it's that they think every piece of land within a mile radius belongs to them. I own a small farm, nothing fancy, just a few acres of land where I grow vegetables and raise a couple of goats. It's my peaceful escape from the chaos of suburban nonsense. Or at least it was until Karen decided my farm was her personal parking lot. It all started when I noticed tire tracks cutting through my property. At first I thought maybe someone had gotten lost, but the second time I saw it, there were multiple cars, neatly lined up in a row, in my field. My private property. Before we dive in, comment where you are watching from. Give a like to this video and subscribe to give support to this channel. I checked my security cameras and there she was, Karen, in all her HOA glory, directing traffic like some self-appointed parking attendant. She had the clipboard, the smug expression, and that undeniable sense of entitlement radiating off her like cheap perfume. I marched over to her house where she was standing in her yard, chatting with another HOA member. I didn't even have to ask, she smirked the moment she saw me. "Oh, don't be dramatic," she said, waving me off like I was a child throwing a tantrum. "Your farm has so much space and we needed overflow parking for our community event." I told her, in no uncertain terms, that my farm was not community property. I didn't care if they were hosting a gala, a bake sale, or a cult initiation, my land was off limits. She just laughed, told me I was being difficult, and suggested I should be a good neighbor. That's when I knew this wasn't over. The next weekend it got worse. Not only were cars still parked on my land, but some of these people had the audacity to set up chairs and tables. Someone even had a barbecue grill on my property. I was fuming. I called the HOA demanding an explanation. They said they'd look into it. Which, in HOA speak, means nothing was going to happen. That's when I decided if they weren't going to listen to words, they were going to listen to actions. I waited until the next big HOA event. This time they had an entire wedding reception planned. Oh yes, Karen had outdone herself, white folding chairs, a makeshift dance floor, even a DJ setup. On my farm. That's when I locked the gate. Not a cheap padlock, either. I got a professional grade chain and lock set up. And then? I packed my bags, set up an out-of-town auto-reply on my email, and went on vacation. The next morning my phone exploded with missed calls. Karen. The HOA. Random numbers I didn't recognize. Voicemails full of yelling. Apparently, people were trapped on my property. And that's exactly how I wanted it. I woke up to the sound of my phone vibrating like it was trying to escape my nightstand. A dozen missed calls. Texts coming in every few seconds. Karen, what the hell have you done? HOA president, this is unacceptable. Remove the lock immediately. Unknown number. My wife is 8 months pregnant, and she's stuck at your stupid farm. Fix this. I stretched, yawned, and took a sip of my hotel coffee, enjoying the ocean breeze from my vacation spot 3 states away. This was going to be a good day. By the time I actually checked my voicemail, it was a goldmine of entitled rage. Karen's was my favorite. You are in so much trouble. You have no idea who you're messing with. This is illegal. You're going to pay for this, you selfish, awful click. Then came the HOA president with his classic mix of fake authority and empty threats. This is a serious violation. You cannot just block people from leaving. If you do not return immediately and unlock the gate, we will take legal action. Sure you will, buddy. The best one though. Some poor guy stuck at the farm who actually seemed reasonable. Hey, I don't know what's going on, but I was just here for the reception and my car's blocked in. Can you, maybe fix this? I almost felt bad for that guy. Almost. Meanwhile, back at my property, chaos was unfolding. The bride and groom had been trying to leave for over an hour, guests were losing their minds, and Karen? Well, she was on the verge of a nuclear meltdown. See, Karen wasn't used to not getting her way. She was the queen of barking orders and making people jump. But now, she was stuck just like everyone else. And when I say stuck, I mean stuck. Because I wasn't an idiot, I knew someone would try to break the lock. That's why I had installed a second lock inside the gate, completely out of reach. And let's not forget my security cameras recording everything. And then, things got even better. Someone, maybe Karen, maybe one of her flying monkeys, called the cops. Perfect. When the officer showed up, Karen practically pounced on him, waving her arms like a lunatic. He locked you in. This is kidnapping. The cop blinked at her. Ma'am, you're outside. What? No, I mean my car is locked in. Okay, but you're free to leave. That's not the point. The officer sighed, walked up to the gate and inspected the lock. Then he looked at the private property and no trespassing signs I had clearly posted. Then he turned back to Karen. Ma'am, Do you have the property owner's permission to be here? Karen stammered, opening and closing her mouth like a fish. Well, it's for the community. The officer nodded. So, no. Karen turned a lovely shade of red. The officer tried calling me, of course. I let it go to voicemail. Let them all stew in their own mess. Meanwhile, Karen was now yelling at the wedding guests, demanding they find a way to open the gate. Some guy tried to climb over the fence but got his suit caught on the top and ended up dangling there like a very sad piñata. I watched all of this later thanks to my security footage. And let me tell you, it was glorious. Then came the best part. After hours of chaos, the officer made a decision. Well, looks like we have some trespassers. If you don't have permission to be here, I'm gonna have to start writing tickets. Cue the panic. People started rushing to explain that they were only here for the wedding, that they didn't know the farm wasn't HOA property. But Karen? She just kept digging herself deeper. This is unfair. He should be the one getting arrested. He's holding our cars hostage. The officer shrugged. You're free to contact the property owner. But from what I can see, you don't have permission to be here. That's trespassing. Karen screamed. Me? I ordered another drink, sat back and smiled. By the time the sun started setting, the situation at my farm had gone from bad to full-blown catastrophe. Karen had burned through every possible tantrum, screaming, threatening lawsuits, and even trying to guilt-trip the police officer. But nothing was working. Meanwhile, the wedding guests were getting restless. Some had already called Ubers and abandoned their cars, deciding it wasn't worth the hassle. Others were still holding out hope that Karen could somehow fix this. Spoiler alert, she couldn't. Then came the next phase of Karen's meltdown. She called the HOA board for backup. Now, the HOA board was a mix of self-important retirees and busybodies who had nothing better to do than police everyone's trash can placement. And the second they heard Karen was in trouble, they swarmed the farm like angry wasps. Enter Greg, the HOA president. Greg was the kind of guy who wore a suit to HOA meetings and talked like he was running a Fortune 500 company instead of a glorified neighborhood complaint club. I knew he'd show up eventually. What I didn't expect. That he'd try to intimidate a police officer. Greg marched up to the gate like he was about to declare war. This is unacceptable. He cannot do this. The officer raised an eyebrow. You mean, the property owner? Who owns the land? Greg's jaw tightened. This is a violation of our community bylaws. The officer sighed. Sir, this land isn't part of your HOA. The bylaws don't apply here. Greg refused to accept reality. Oh, trust me, we'll see about that. We'll be taking legal action immediately. The officer didn't even blink. You do that. Karen seized the moment. This is illegal detainment. He locked us in. The officer was beyond done at this point. No, ma'am. Your cars are inside a private property where you were trespassing. You are free to leave at any time. Greg clenched his fists. You realize we have a lawyer, right? The officer shrugged. So does he. That's when Greg switched tactics. He turned to the wedding guests, trying to rally them. This man has ruined your special day. This is an outrage. He has no right to treat you this way. We should all demand he fixes this immediately. For a second I thought the guests might actually turn on me. But instead, the groom, yes, the actual groom, crossed his arms and said, Wait, you mean he owns this farm? Greg blinked. Yes, but... And you guys just used it without asking? Karen froze. A couple of guests started whispering, putting the pieces together. They had all just assumed the farm was part of the HOA's common areas. But now they realized the truth. Karen had lied to them. The bride stepped forward, her hands on her hips. Karen, did you seriously book my wedding on someone else's land without asking? Karen went pale. I thought it was part of the community. I mean, it's always been open. The bride wasn't buying it. So you didn't actually pay for the venue? Greg jumped in. Let's not make a big deal out of this. But it was too late. The wedding guests were turning on them one by one. We gave you money for the venue. You said this was an official event. Wait, where did that money go? Karen looked like she wanted to disappear. That's when Greg made his final mistake. He pointed at the cop. I demand you cut this lock right now. The officer sighed, reached for his radio and muttered, Dispatch, I might need backup. Karen completely lost it. This is outrageous. He can't do this. I'll sue him into oblivion. And me? I sat back, sipped my drink and watched Karen's world burn. Karen was in full meltdown mode, but the real show was just getting started. By now, the wedding guests had completely turned against her. What had started as a joyful celebration was now a heated argument in the middle of a farm-turned-illegal parking lot. And Greg? The HOA president extraordinaire? He was about to make things way worse for himself. Greg hated losing control. He wasn't used to people standing up to him, and now, with his reputation on the line, he did the dumbest thing possible. "I'm calling a tow truck," he declared. "I'll have all these cars removed. Right now." A murmur spread through the crowd. Some people perked up, hopeful that this nightmare might actually end. But I couldn't help but smirk. Because there was just one problem with Greg's brilliant plan. He couldn't tow cars off private property without my permission. I crossed my arms and said, "Go ahead." Greg hesitated. "I don't need your permission." I chuckled. "Yes, you do. And any tow company that tries to take a car off my land without my authorization is committing theft." Greg's mouth snapped shut. But Karen wasn't as quick on the uptake. "Fine. We'll call our tow company." Now this was interesting. Because if Karen was planning to call the HOA's tow service, that meant she'd have to get the cars towed somewhere. And since the HOA didn't own the farm, that meant, oh, this was going to be fun. "Karen," I said slowly, just out of curiosity, "where exactly are you planning to tow all these cars?" Karen blinked. "Huh. I mean, they can't tow them to the street. That's public property. And if they tow them to an HOA lot, they'd need legal authorization from the vehicle owners." Karen's face dropped. Greg caught on a second too late. "You don't have to make this complicated," he snapped. "Just open the gate." I smiled. "Oh, I will." At this point, most of the wedding guests were done. A few had already left in Ubers, while others stood around, arms crossed, waiting to see how this disaster would end. The bride and groom were furious. The realization that their wedding had been built on a lie had ruined whatever joy they had left in the day. But Karen? Karen was desperate. And desperate people do stupid things. She suddenly whipped around to face the officer. "I want him arrested," she shrieked. "This is hostage-taking." The officer looked at her like she had just grown a second head. "Ma'am, that's not how laws work." Karen wasn't listening. She lunged for the lock, fumbling with it like she thought she could magically rip it off with her bare hands. The officer immediately stepped in. "Ma'am, if you don't step back right now, I will place you under arrest for trespassing." That finally got through to her. She froze, looking around wildly for support. But the HOA board members had started backing away. The guests? They wanted no part of this. And Greg? Greg had already pulled out his phone and was furiously typing something, probably a frantic email to whatever overpaid HOA lawyer they had on speed dial. That's when I decided to speed things up. I walked to the gate, grabbed the lock, and made a show of unlocking it as slowly as possible. The second it clicked open, Karen shoved past me. Big mistake. As Karen stormed toward her car, she failed to notice one crucial detail. In her blind rage, she had parked directly in front of the cattle gate. A gate that, up until this very moment, had been keeping my cows from wandering onto the gravel driveway. With the gate wide open, the cows did what cows do best. They walked straight into the mess. A chorus of horrified screams erupted as a dozen half-ton farm animals casually meandered into the sea of abandoned vehicles. Karen's entitled fury instantly turned into sheer panic. "No, no, no, get them away from my car." But cows? Cows don't take orders from Karens. One particularly curious steer stuck his head through an open window, sniffing around for food. Another one decided that Karen's bumper looked like a good scratching post. The wedding guests scrambled out of the way, watching helplessly as the cows claimed the parking lot as their own. And me? I just leaned against the fence and said, "Ha! Looks like you've got bigger problems now." Karen's scream of frustration could probably be heard from space. And that was the moment I knew, this war wasn't over yet. He thought Karen was done. Oh no. She was just getting started. With cows wandering through her wedding guests, a parking lot that looked like a stampede waiting to happen, and the HOA board slowly backing away like they wanted nothing to do with her, you'd think she'd take the loss. But this was Karen. Taking the loss wasn't an option. Karen's face was beet red. Her hands were shaking with rage. The bride and groom, who had tried to make themselves invisible, suddenly became her next target. "You," she screeched, pointing at them like some deranged courtroom judge. "You're paying for this mess." The bride, who had clearly had enough of this nightmare, laughed in pure disbelief. "We're paying?" she shot back. "You told us it was fine to park here." Karen wasn't having it. "You ruined my event. I told you I had this handled." "Handled?" the groom barked. "Handled? Our wedding got shut down by the police." That's when Greg, the cowardly HOA president, decided to chime in. "I think," he started, speaking in his phony authoritative voice, "that we should all calm down and figure out the best way to fix this situation." I snorted. "Oh? And what's your brilliant plan, Greg?" Greg cleared his throat. "We'll pay for the damages and in exchange you'll agree to drop this whole thing." Now, if Greg had made this offer 2 hours ago, I might have considered it. But after all the insults, threats, and entitlement? No chance. I leaned in, lowering my voice. "Oh, I'm not dropping anything, Greg." Greg stiffened. "What do you mean?" I smiled. "I mean this isn't over. Not by a long shot." At this point, most of the guests were leaving. A few tried to get to their cars, but with the cows blocking half the lot, it was a slow, chaotic process. Karen looked ready to explode. Her grand event had turned into a laughingstock, and the one thing she cared about most, control, was slipping through her fingers. That's when she and Greg exchanged a look. A very suspicious look. And that's when I knew they were up to something. Sure enough, Greg took a deep breath and said, "Fine. But don't think you've won. The HOA has the authority to issue fines for violations." I raised an eyebrow. "Violations?" He smirked. "We'll be sending you a fine for having unauthorized livestock roaming a residential zone." I blinked. Then I laughed. "Because this was their big move?" "Oh, that's cute, Greg," I said, shaking my head. "But see, you're forgetting something." Greg frowned. "What?" "This isn't a residential zone," I said slowly. "It's privately owned farmland. And you?" I pointed at the mess of parked cars. "You trespassed." Greg's face dropped. Karen gasped. "That's a technicality." I shrugged. "Call it what you want, but I've got a police report, a dozen witnesses, and security footage backing me up." Greg's mouth opened and closed, like a fish that just realized it was flopping on dry land. Then, before he could say another word, the officer stepped forward. "Actually," the officer said, flipping through his notes, "that reminds me. Mr. Greg, I need to talk to you about the HOA's responsibility in this trespassing case." Greg went white as a ghost. "And Karen?" She let out the most dramatic gasp I'd ever heard. I just folded my arms. "Good luck with that, Greg." At this point, I should have expected it. Karen wasn't about to walk away quietly. She stomped toward me, teeth clenched, looking like she was about to explode. "You're a monster," she shrieked. "You ruined everything." I raised an eyebrow. "I ruined everything?" Karen actually growled. "You think you're so smart, don't you?" I grinned. "I mean, compared to you? Yeah." Karen screamed in frustration, grabbed the nearest wedding decoration, and hurled it straight at me. But she must have forgotten one crucial detail. There was still a cow standing directly behind me. The object? It didn't hit me. It hit the cow. A half-ton animal that wasn't in the mood for Karen's nonsense. The cow startled, let out a loud snort, and bolted forward straight toward Karen. The instant karma was glorious. Karen shrieked, tried to run, and tripped over her own dress. She face-planted in the mud. The wedding guests, dead silent. Then someone snorted. Then another person choked back laughter. And within seconds the whole parking lot erupted in laughter. Karen, covered in mud, screamed in rage. And that was when I knew it was over. Karen had lost. But what I didn't realize, she still had one last card to play. You'd think falling face first into the mud in front of an entire wedding party would be enough to break Karen. But no. Karen was like a villain in a bad horror movie. Just when you thought she was finished, she came back even worse. And this time, she was out for blood. As Karen peeled herself off the ground, mud dripping from her once perfect hair, she didn't scream. She didn't throw a tantrum. She just stood up, shaking with rage, and fixed her eyes on me like a wild animal backed into a corner. "You think you've won?" she said, her voice low and dangerous. I narrowed my eyes. "I know I have." Karen wiped the mud from her face, smearing it even worse, and spat. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." Greg, who had been desperately pretending not to exist, suddenly looked worried. Karen, maybe we should." "No," Karen cut him off. "I'm handling this." Then she took one step closer to me, eyes blazing. "I hope you're ready," she hissed. "Because by the time I'm done, you'll wish you never messed with me." Then she turned on her heel, stormed off to her car, and sped out of the parking lot like a madwoman on a mission. And that's when I knew she was about to do something truly insane. I didn't have to wait long to find out what Karen had planned. The next morning I woke up to a nightmare. A letter. Not just any letter, an official-looking one with an HOA header that was so ridiculous I had to laugh. I ripped it open. And there it was. A formal eviction notice. I actually had to read it twice to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. According to Karen's masterpiece of nonsense, I was being evicted for allowing livestock to roam freely on HOA property, defacing a public event with reckless behavior, disrupting the peace of the community. Oh, and my personal favorite? Engaging in willful misconduct and malicious property damage. I laughed. I laughed so hard I actually had to sit down. She really thought she could kick me off my own farm. Now, I could have ignored the letter. But where's the fun in that? I walked straight into the HOA office that afternoon, slammed the letter on the desk and looked Greg dead in the eye. What the hell is this? Greg winced. Ah, you got the letter? Damn right I did. I crossed my arms. And you do realize this isn't legal, right? Greg sighed and rubbed his temples. Look, I know this is crazy, but Karen. Karen what? I snapped. Karen made this up out of thin air? Greg hesitated. And that was all the answer I needed. Jesus, Greg, I said, shaking my head. Even for you this is pathetic. That's when I noticed something strange. Greg looked stressed. And not in the usual, I'm an HOA president and people yell at me way. No, this was real stress. The kind you get when something's spiraling out of control. I leaned in. She's losing it, isn't she? Greg hesitated. Then finally he cracked. She called an emergency board meeting last night, he admitted. She wants the HOA to buy your land. I blinked. Excuse me? She says if we don't, she'll take legal action against the entire board. Now that was interesting. Karen was threatening the HOA now? Oh, this was getting good. By the time the HOA meeting rolled around, I had front row seats to the biggest self-destruction I'd ever seen. Karen was already going off by the time I walked in. This is a crisis, she shrieked, slamming her hands on the table. If we don't take action immediately, we're all in danger. A few board members exchanged nervous glances. Greg, looking exhausted, sighed. Karen, we've been over this. We can't just buy someone's property. Oh, so you're on his side now? Karen snapped. Greg groaned. It's not about sides, Karen, it's about what's legal. That's when she lost it. You're all useless, she screamed. This community is falling apart because none of you have the backbone to stand up to that man. That's when I made my entrance. Ah, speaking of that man, I said, strolling in. I hear someone's trying to steal my land. Karen whipped around, eyes wild. You. Me, I said, smirking. And before you waste any more breath, let me make something very, very clear. I took a step forward. You don't own my land. Another step. You have no legal right to tell me what to do. And then I smiled. And now? You don't even have the HOA on your side. Karen froze. She turned wild-eyed to Greg. You're not really siding with him? She whispered. Greg sighed. Karen, just stop. Silence. Then Karen did something I didn't expect. She burst into tears. Right there in front of everyone. This was supposed to be my community, she sobbed. I worked so hard to make everything perfect. The board members looked away, uncomfortable. Greg muttered, Jesus Christ. And me? I just stood there, watching. Because this was better than revenge. This was justice. But Karen? Oh, she wasn't finished yet. Because that night, something even crazier happened. Something that made everything before look like child's play. If Karen had any self-preservation instincts, she would have taken the massive L at that HOA meeting and disappeared into the shadows. But Karen wasn't built that way. She had one last desperate move, and trust me, this was her worst one yet. That night, I was sitting on my porch enjoying a well-earned beer when I noticed something weird. Headlights. Multiple. At first, I thought it was just some lost tourist trying to turn around. But when I saw the 4 black SUVs roll up to my front gate, I knew. Karen wasn't done yet. I set my beer down, stood up, and watched as 8 men in suits stepped out of the vehicles. One of them, a short, stocky guy with slicked-back hair, strode forward like he owned the place. When he got to my gate, he pulled out a stack of papers, cleared his throat, and announced, Sir, I'm here on behalf of the HOA. You are now legally required to vacate these premises immediately. I laughed so hard I almost choked. You serious? I asked, walking up to the gate. The guy narrowed his eyes. This is not a joke, sir. If you refuse, we will take further action. I smirked. Define further action. He snapped his fingers and 2 of the other goons walked up, looking ready to start some nonsense. That's when I realized. Karen had gone full mob boss mode. She must have hired these guys, hoping to intimidate me into just giving up my land. And honestly, it was adorable. I crossed my arms. All right, tell me exactly what law I'm breaking by standing on my own property. The guy in the suit hesitated. "We have authority granted by the HOA to." "No, you don't." I cut him off. "And I have the legal documents to prove it." I pulled out my phone and tapped a few times. Then, with the biggest grin, I turned my screen around. It was an email from my lawyer. An official cease and desist letter. Addressed directly to Karen. And at the bottom? A court order stating that the HOA had zero legal rights to enforce anything on my farm. The guy went pale. "Now," I said, stepping forward, "if you and your little friends don't get off my property in the next 30 seconds, I'll be forced to take further action." The guy gulped. "You don't have." That's when I pulled out my second phone and held it up, showing them the live security camera feed, recording every single thing, including their license plates. "Oh, and did I mention?" I added, "my lawyer is watching this live." That's when the guy panicked. He muttered something into his earpiece, then turned to the others. "Let's go." The goons hesitated. "But now." They turned, scrambled back into their black SUVs, and within seconds they were gone. And me? I just stood there shaking my head. Karen had actually tried to hire fake enforcers to scare me. And it backfired spectacularly. By morning the news had spread. And I mean everywhere. See, Karen had overplayed her hand. And Greg? Greg was done covering for her. By noon I got a very interesting email. It was from the HOA board. Subject line: Karen has been removed. I clicked it open and sure enough, Karen had been voted out of the HOA. Not suspended. Not temporarily removed. Fired. And the best part? She wasn't just kicked out of the HOA, she was banned from holding any position in any homeowners association ever again. Turns out, when you try to stage a fake eviction, people don't want you in charge of anything. As for Karen? Well, she tried one last time to plead her case. She showed up at an emergency board meeting, begging them to reconsider. Greg told me she was crying, blaming everyone but herself. And when it became painfully obvious that no one was buying it, she did what every Karen does when they lose. She screamed, "I'll sue all of you." And then she stormed out. With Karen gone, things finally went back to normal. The HOA? Chilled out. Greg resigned 2 weeks later. And me? I got exactly what I wanted. A farm. And the satisfaction of knowing that Karen destroyed herself in the most humiliating way possible. Oh, and just to really rub it in? A few months later, Karen's house went up for sale. She left the neighborhood. I guess she couldn't handle living in a place where she was a nobody. And honestly, that was better revenge than anything I could have planned. Karen was gone. Not just from the HOA, not just from her position of fake authority, but from the entire neighborhood. Her house sat empty for weeks. And I was loving every second of it. But the best part? Karen's downfall wasn't over yet. About a month after Karen slithered away, I got an email from the HOA board. At first, I thought they were going to try something new. But when I opened it, I actually burst out laughing. They wanted me to join the HOA. Yeah, me. They claimed that since I had exposed Karen's corruption, they wanted a fair and reasonable person to help improve community relations. Translation? They were desperate. See, Karen had dragged the HOA's reputation through the mud. Neighbors were furious about the mess she created, and the board needed someone to clean up her disaster. And they thought that person was me. So, I did what any reasonable person would do. I sent them a one-line response. Absolutely not. But thanks for the laugh. Just when I thought this saga was over, I got a juicy update. Karen's house? It wasn't selling. Turns out, people don't want to buy a property with a toxic history. See, word had spread about who used to live there. Prospective buyers would tour the place, hear about the former HOA tyrant, and suddenly lose interest. But the best part? Karen had already bought a new house, assuming hers would sell quickly, which meant she was bleeding money. Mortgage on the old house. Mortgage on the new house. No buyers. And since she was banned from holding any HOA position, she couldn't even worm her way into another power trip. She was stuck. And then, one fateful day, a for rent sign went up in her front yard. She had given up trying to sell and was now desperately looking for renters just to cover her losses. And that's when I got an idea. I made a call. See, I had a friend looking for a rental, a single dad with 3 kids and a gigantic Great Dane. A dog the size of a small horse. A dog that, by the way, would have broken every single one of Karen's old HOA rules. And wouldn't you know it? He signed the lease. So now, in the house where Karen once ruled like a dictator, there was a massive dog tearing through the yard. Kids leaving their bikes on the driveway. A backyard full of toys, soccer nets, and a trampoline. All things Karen hated with a passion. And she had no power to stop it. I like to imagine her checking on the property, seeing it completely transformed, and realizing she had lost everything. And honestly, that was the best revenge of all. A few months later, I ran into Greg at the hardware store. He had left the HOA board, started minding his own business, and actually seemed happier without Karen breathing down his neck. We chatted for a bit, and as I was about to leave, he smirked and said, "You know Karen still talks about you, right?" "Oh yeah," I said. "What's she saying?" Greg chuckled. "She calls you the worst thing that ever happened to her." I grinned. "Good." And with that I walked out. Because at the end of the day, I won. Karen lost. And my farm? It's mine. Forever.